episode 9. Duran is our latest guest, and I actually reached out a couple weeks back after totally unrelated, not thinking about doing an Easter-specific episode. Found again Duran's content online, VeriMyth Pictures, and specifically became enamored by the Shroud of Turin. And is that like the correct pronunciation of it? Because I've heard like Turin.
The Shroud of Turin.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
to be fair, I'm not sure how the Italians say it, but that's how we Americans say it.
And that's
the Shroud
what
of Turin.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And you know, I would love to say, you know, I heard about it previously, just never thought much about it, but I really never heard about it until Joe Rogan. Of course, he had a conversation about it originally. One of his guests that's kind of renowned for being a conspiracy theorist guy was talking that he's like gone all in on it. And I was thinking, hey, I've never heard about this before. Let me at least look into it. And I came across your videos. I don't know if they were the first pieces of content that I came across, but yours were definitely the standout pieces of content that I felt like gave it a fair shake.
Thank you.
I do think I want to present that you did come at it that while you may have a bias, you were also talking about it from like, hey, let's take Jesus out of the picture, right? and just talk about how was this created? When was it created? Who created it? And to me, that's just as fascinating, regardless of whether or not it's actually connected to Jesus, which I'm not ruling out, right? But
sure.
Anyway, talk about how you got into the Shroud of Turin, if you don't mind, and what led you to making those videos.
And if I can also add, give us a little background on what it is, when it was, if you have all that, when it was discovered, and you know who brought it forth. A little bit of background as well for people that might not be familiar.
Background on the Shroud?
Yeah,
of course.
It was in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken, or 80s or 90s, wasn't it?
Well, no, it's been around a lot longer than that.
Okay. That's when it seemed like the news got really big about it. That I remember, I thought it was in the early 80s.
So I'll explain that in a moment. The way that I got into it was, so when I was in middle school, I was the kid who would check out all of the weird books at the library. I liked reading about Bigfoot and aliens and ghosts and hauntings and stuff like that. And sometimes in these like books about like mysteries of the world, you know, you'd find these pictures of the Shroud of Turin in there as well. There's, you know, image of Jesus. Now it would also be thrown in with like appearances of Mary and appearances of angels and other things other miracles that have been associated with the Catholic Church, stuff like that. And I just read it as part of that stuff. And so that was sort of the first time that I was interested in it, was way back in middle school. But then as my faith grew as a Christian in high school, and I started to get more interested in Christian apologetics and the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, the Shroud of Turin sort of came back to the surface for me, and I realized that, there's actually like a whole field of research about this thing that stands apart from all of the other weird relics and stories from like the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches and stuff like that. And actually, so my dad was very much into apologetics as well, and he read a couple of books on the Shroud because he was curious, and he actually gave a presentation on it first. He gave a talk on it first before I ever did, and he laid out sort of the basic the bullet points, the highlights of the case for the Shroud, and that got me really interested as well. And eventually I asked my dad, I said, can you give me all that stuff, and I'm going to like go farther with it. And I just started digging way more into all of that research and found that, it's just one of the most incredible things in the world. There's just not much more you can say about it in terms of just how amazing it is. Now, in terms of your question for like how long it's been around, so it was first photographed in 1899 by an Italian guy named Secondo Pia. He was given permission to come photograph it for the very first time because photography was still really new. And when he took his photographs, he discovered that the photo negatives on the glass plates that he had came out as positives. And this is one of the most remarkable things about the shroud, is that when he took a picture of it, he realized that the image on the shroud was itself a photonegative, and that when you look at the actual photonegative, the image becomes photopositive. And he was so amazed by this that, he was so amazed by this that he almost dropped the glass plate. And when he showed his results to people, they thought he was crazy. And from then on, that was when the shroud, which had formerly been an object of religious veneration, of course, because it's an image of Christ and it's, this very mysterious thing, but it went from being just another relic in a church to being an object of like actual scientific scrutiny when Secundo Pius photographed it for the first time there at the very end of the 19th century. And for the next 70 years or so, people tried to do as much research as they could without having access to it. And then in 1978, a team of scientists called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or just STURP for short. STURP was granted 120 hours straight to research the shroud hands-on, to do all kinds of experiments, everything that they could think of to do. They took sticky tape samples, they took micro photographs of it, they shined UV light on it, they lit it from behind to see, they also unsewed the backing cloth from it. It's called the Holland cloth that had been sewn onto it at centuries before just to give it more structure. And so they did all that kind of research. And so 1978 was when all of that scientific research started to come out, because what they expected when they walked in, they expected to walk in and just scrape the paint off of it. They'd be like, okay, well, it's just a fancy, weird painting, right? But what they found was that there is no paint that makes up the image itself. The image is not made of anything that an artist would use to create an image. So it's not paint, it's not a stain, there's no ink, there's no pigments, no powders. So that just opened up a whole new field of research, which we now call syndenology, which is literally the study of the Shroud of Turin, and also the Sudarium of Oviedo, which is a second cloth that I can talk about later, perhaps. So when they discovered that the image was not made of paint, suddenly they had a real mystery on their hands, which was, how was this thing made?
And that was in the, what time frame was that when that realization came forth?
Yeah, that was in 1978.
Okay.
Now, we do know, we're kind of arrogant in our modern knowledge, right? But as it turns out, centuries before, like centuries earlier, if you look at some of the historical evidence of where the shroud came from, one of the early names that it was called was Akira Poieton, which in Greek means not made with human hands. As it turns out, these ancient people were also smart enough to realize that it was not paint. But that realization, because it was stowed away for so long, was sort of lost on the common population. So in 1978, they discovered, the image is not made of paint. And they did take some samples of it. And in 1988, they did a carbon dating test on it, which did come back.
This is what I remember.
Yes.
I was in school at the
This
time.
is where it really sort of took off, because everybody was fascinated by it. But in 1988, the carbon dating results came back that it was from the Middle Ages,
right,
between the 1200s and 1300s, which is incidentally exactly the point in history where we know that it started, because 1355 was the year that it sort of officially went on display in France, and the Descharny family was literally selling admission to go see it. So that's like the first known point of it in history, tracing it back from modern times.
Let me just go on a little offshoot. So one of the more fascinating aspects, of course, it's found in the mid 1300s, and then I think the first pope, or the pope at the time, he had kind of written it off as a hoax type of piece. But what's fascinating to me, as was determined by STURP, it was not made by a painting. It wasn't made by traditional artistic methods, right?
Yeah.
And there's been some people that have claimed to create like close approximations of it using like different acid baths or kind of modern or kind of older now, like photographic negative techniques, but never to like any sort of detail that the shroud was created in. Doesn't have the same sort of like 3D depth map to it that I understand, and like these recreations that have all of like the benefits of modern technology. And so again, even just removing Jesus from the equation, it's like, if this was created in the mid 1300s, who and how? Because they essentially predated photography or photographic principles by 500 years.
Yeah, and let me clarify those points.
Yeah.
It wasn't the Pope who wrote it off. It was a bishop who was writing a letter to the Pope, and actually the letter was never sent. But if you dig into what was going on there, there was some political stuff in the church that there would have been ulterior motives.
Wait, that's just not recent, like political bias? Not
No.
Political things
bias
happening in the church,
Exactly.
especially during that time when the church controlled everything about life. Are you
Right,
kidding me?
exactly.
How could that be?
Yes, there were struggles for power and validity and all that sort of stuff back then as well. So this bishop was writing to the Pope to try to invalidate somebody else, who he was, that story is its own thing. But the funny thing is, like you said, that letter says that the shroud was a painting. But we know now that it absolutely is not a painting. It wasn't created with paint.
Can I ask you real quickly, are you aware of any other shrouds that would fall into the same category, that they have an image that is on them, but it is not paint? And I would think if a body was wrapped in this shroud, whenever this was, way back,
Right.
there would be other bodies, there would be other shrouds that would kind of fit in the same category. Are you aware of any?
There are none.
That's it. See, that to me is what's fascinating.
There's nothing like it. And to make it worse, in terms of the shroud image itself being a photo negative, there is no other work of art in the entire history of art that looks anything like that. If you try to look for Renaissance art or medieval art, or even going farther back, anything that looks like photonegativity, because you could imagine that maybe an artist could come up with this concept, right, that okay, the lights become darks and the darks become lights in the image, and so it might create a cool effect. But there's nothing. There is no artist ever created anything that resembles photonegativity until the invention of photography, until people could actually see photonegativity for themselves, when it was invented for that purpose. So there's nothing in the history of art that looks anything like the shroud. There is such a thing as a decomposition stain, where if somebody, for example, dies in their bed and they're not discovered for a few days or so, the body will start to decompose and it will leave a stain on those cloths. But decomposition stains are just big blurry blobs. That's all they are. They don't leave any kind of image, much less a shape of any kind. In fact, it's kind of gross. If you look at pictures of decomposition stains, it doesn't look anything like the shroud at all.
No, one other element from the dating that was done in 1988, again, please clarify where I may have it wrong, or as you understand I have it wrong, that it was dated back to, somewhere around the 1300s, right, when it was discovered.
Yeah.
Those pieces were taken, or at least supposedly taken, from the edges, or some of the edges of the cloth where it could have been touched up. I think I heard like some nun or someone within the religious establishment, I don't know exactly, touched it up. And so it's likely that those samples that were sent to, again, as I understand it, 3 independent research laboratories, each of them were supposed to be doing it under like a placebo, or a blind test. And again, as I understand it, they were told when this was supposed to be from, the cloth sample. And so, of course, all of their dates just happened to align with the date they were told it was thought to be from. Does that align with your understanding?
Yeah, there are some questions about the integrity of the experiments that were done to perform the carbon dating. How much each of the laboratories knew about, how to conduct the experiment and such. But the bigger problem really is the cotton fibers that were woven into the edges. I mean, first of all, you have the problem of the fact that throughout the centuries, the edges of the shroud is the part that has been most touched by people who have picked it up and tried to put it on display, because they don't want to touch the main body of it, of course. So the edges are the parts that are by far the most contaminated, which means that those were the areas that were frayed more than the rest of the shroud. So the edges are sort of frayed and broken, and at different times in history, certain groups have tried to repair those pieces just to preserve the integrity of the shroud structure, but also to just make it look a little better as well so that it doesn't come undone. So we know for a fact, for example, that the shroud was in a fire in the 1500s, and it was being kept in a silver box. The silver box started to melt from the fire, and the shroud actually suffered some burns on it. If you look at the shroud, you'll see that it has these very peculiar, like, triangular marks that are on there.
Can you go back to the image that you, because I know about it's like the psychedelic looking.
Yes, yeah, it almost looks like a psychedelic sort of ink blot, sort of a Rorschach test type of design there.
So you're talking about the white, those
triangular patterns.
There's 4 of them. I see 4 on the left.
Exactly.
And then like 6 on the right.
Yeah, those are where the shroud was folded up, and then the fire burned the corners where it was folded. So those are actually holes in the shroud. But because there is what's called the Holland cloth sewn to the back of it, it looks like it's just part of the rest of the cloth, because I believe those patches are sewn up
that
as well.
White we're seeing, or that image, is the backing cloth,
right,
showing through the holes.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes,
I did not know that. So.
Yes, exactly. So we know that some nuns repaired the shroud at that time in the 1500s, and we also know, thanks to King Umberto II, who was the very last king of Italy, who lived in the 40s, according to him, his family is the one that owned the shroud up until the late 20th century. He was part of the House of Savoy. They were the ones who owned the shroud up to that point before, when he died, it went to the Vatican. But according to him, his family would take threads from the edges of the shroud and give them to each other as presents, as souvenirs. So they were literally taking pieces off of the edges of the shroud. So the edges were, eventually it started to look kind of bad. And so according to him, in the 1600s, the shroud edges were repaired by sewing cotton threads into the shroud that were dyed brown so that it would match the color of the shroud itself. And what makes this even more frustrating when you think about the carbon dating is that when the carbon dating was done in 1988, the scientists were already aware of these cotton fibers. And it's not entirely clear what steps they took to prevent contamination from those cotton fibers. So in 2005, a shroud skeptic, someone who doesn't believe in the authenticity of the shroud, he re-examined one of these samples that had been carbon dated, and he found cotton threads in that sample, which just goes to prove that the carbon dating tests were contaminated by the cotton threads.
So that's a main argument, because I've always had a hard time with the carbon date, because everybody in my generation, we were sitting around with bated breath when that test was done. Yeah, and then it comes back, and it was just it was a major deflation for a lot of people. Yeah, because they really wanted it to show that it dated back further. So I've always struggled with how do you overcome the carbon dating test results, and you kind of just answered some of that, but
really quick.
Fortunately, well, yeah, you're right. If you Google the Shroud right now, you're going to, like, the carbon dating is going to be like the first thing on there. It'll be like
debunked, carbon dated.
Yeah, exactly.
And
at least like 3 or 4 times a year, some article written by a third-rate online blogger goes viral for saying, "Oh, Shroud's been disproven again and again," and they always come back to this carbon dating, and it's just they're not really keeping up with the science. They're not keeping up with the research.
And that's actually something that I wanted to touch on. Much like people have faith in religion, something that they can't believe, same thing goes with science, right?
Yeah.
But it's now you're looked at as a crackpot. Just trust the science. Well, science is an ever-evolving, way of questioning what is known or understood, right? And
Yes.
So I had written down this statement. Many modern Christians, and I don't think it's just Christians, but especially in evangelical cases, impose unnecessary rules that aren't central to the faith, like young earth creationism or banning things like Harry Potter. And it's like, hey, if you believe in these things, you're just as good as not believing in the rest of what we're supposed to believe in.
Yeah.
And I think we see that outside of religion as well. But I did notice that when I was looking at the Shroud of Turin, where you would have people just trying to have good faith conversations online, and people were citing sources. But then they were getting shouted down, and then people that were citing like Wikipedia, they are the ones presenting the fact, hey, you could just look at it on Wikipedia. And it's like, that's really just ironic, where typically you don't see that approach, or I haven't seen that from a religious perspective, where religious people are coming with citing sources outside of Wikipedia, where, well, there's like sources within Wikipedia, and you could cite those, but oftentimes those sources within Wikipedia aren't actually relevant to the source material that Wikipedia article is covering, or it's just like one minute detail that's cursory.
Yeah, and if you go to the Wikipedia page on the Shroud of Turin, there will be a lot of good information there, but if you go down to the carbon dating section, whoever has been managing that part of it, they basically they acknowledge the experiment that I mentioned in 2005 by Raymond Rogers, but then they just say, but a couple of other scientists have disputed that claim, and that's really all it says. And it doesn't say anything about what their dispute was with the findings, much less whether they were good disputes or not, good objections. So I have a friend named Eric Pogel who has written an extremely extensive article online that I do reference in my video about these objections to Raymond Rogers' findings about the cotton fibers, and he just tears it to shreds. Nobody has any good objections to this.
Question. Okay, so I'm pretty fascinated with the carbon dating thing, because that's So. And the test was from the outside, right?
Yes.
So
the edges, yeah.
This is such an important, you would agree, this is a very important relic or
piece of history. Human history.
And the Christian church, which used to control the Western civilization as we know it.
Yeah.
Why is there not an effort, this is a challenge in a non-aggressive way, why hasn't there been some willingness to go into the center of the shroud and cut a piece big enough to do a carbon dating test? That's my big concern as to why it's such an important relic, such an important thing to Christianity. It's like they're not willing to do that. They don't want to do that because there's the risk of it coming back again saying it's from the Middle Ages.
I don't think that that's the concern. I understand why people would think that would be the concern. It's really, the concern is quite political. And some of it goes back to all of the drama that surrounded the 1988 dating, which was people argued about who the samples belonged to, where they were supposed to go, who had the right to actually cut the samples from the shroud. So there was a lot of internal arguing. And so on the one hand, I don't blame the Catholic Church for being hesitant to just let any old scientist walk in there and cut another piece off. Because the truth is that if you're going to do another carbon dating test, you're going to have to take a piece from a spot that's
a significant position.
Right.
Yeah. Fortunately, the dorsal image, I think, would be a good option for that. If the dorsal image maybe is not, it's possible maybe it could be more contaminated than the front side. Then again, the front side has probably been handled more than the dorsal image. But you would almost certainly, you would want to get a clean piece from a part of the cloth where there is no image and where there is no blood. And then you would want to get a piece as well from the image itself. And that's the really controversial part is you want to cut a piece off of this miraculous image of Jesus. Now, personally, I mean, I'm a believer in the shroud. I think that God gave it to us so that we could do tests on it and put God to the test in a sense in that way. But it's still very sensitive. It's like, who's going to do this? And believe me, there are people who request the privilege to do this all the time.
I can only imagine.
And they're working on it. I think it's going to happen eventually, but it's just going to take time to make those connections.
This is one of those things which seems pretty straightforward and on the surface, but when you delve into the politics and all the other layers of this is a very complex issue that basically could the extremes of it could undermine the Christian church in the Western Hemisphere.
It could upend understanding of humanity.
It could. Of course, on the other hand, if it did prove, if the test came back and proved that it was much older than what it is put forth with carbon dating from the 80s or whatnot, then it would be a huge boost to Christianity, I think.
Well,
there really is, in my opinion, there's too much at stake to test it in this way. There's too much at stake, and the agnostic or the anti-Christian person would say that the Catholic Church has too much to lose to test it the way I'm talking about. I'm being real blunt here. I'm laying it out. But you've heard this before, I'm sure.
Well, it would certainly be, as someone who, I get very excited about the shroud. I am a very firm believer in its authenticity. It would be very disappointing to get a new carbon dating result back
that reaffirmed the first date.
That matched the original medieval date. But there's also all sorts of questions about. See the other thing that's tough about this is if the image was formed by radiation, then how do we even know that a valid carbon dating test would even come back with the accurate date? We don't know exactly how the cloth has been manipulated by the radiation that supposedly caused the image. So we just don't know. But the other thing, too, I wanted to say about that is that what they're working on, what these shroud researchers are working on, is trying to get something more like STURP, another chance at doing something like STURP again. Because obviously all of our technology has improved since the 70s.
Yeah.
And so it would be really nice not just to go back in for carbon dating samples, but to redo some of the other stuff too that came back somewhat inconclusive. Like, for example, in 1978, they took the sticky samples of the pollen from the shroud. But the researcher who was doing the research on the pollen passed away before he could really finish it, and he was a pollen expert, so there's nobody else who's been able to come back and go back in there and figure that out. His name was Max Fried. I could be getting that wrong, but so that's why I don't tend to use the pollen evidence as solid proof, as actual evidence toward the shroud. It's just there. It's something to think about. And it's also possible that, maybe some of the other stranger suggestions about the shroud image, like, for example, that there might be first century coins over the eyes, maybe some of that could be further analyzed as well. So if anybody does get a chance to go back in to analyze the shroud, they want to they want to swing for a home run and try to get everything that they possibly can, which is why it's just going to take time to negotiate to have that sort of thing. And also you risk, of course, too, nowadays the shroud is far better known and more popular than it used to be, and they don't want anything to happen to it. The last thing you want is for some crazy environmentalist to get in there and dump paint on it or something. Yeah. So that's why it's almost never put on public display anymore. It's just because they just don't want the wrong person.
Destruction, and I do think there is something to be said. What you were saying about it really upending the Catholic Church, Christianity, if it were to come out and say, there's new dating that suggested it was also lined up with the 1300s, which again, I'm very skeptical of that dating from what I've heard, that those 3 university research labs, not only were they told the date that this cloth or material was from, again, from what I heard, they were also told what it was from when they're supposed to go into a line. But there is also, and I guess it's a newer form of scientific dating, but there's some recent X-ray dating. I think you might have also touched on that. Also, yes. Again, while less maybe accepted, across the board, does seem to suggest that it is older, about 2,000 years old, and contradicts the 1988 carbon dating. So
yeah, there have been other dating experiments done on the shroud, and none of the others have come back with the medieval date that the carbon dating did. So the most recent one was in 2022, I believe. An Italian scientist, and I've forgotten his name now, unfortunately. It's in my video. He did what's called an X-ray scattering test on the shroud.
Luigi something, and not the United Healthcare killer.
No. Not that guy. Let me see if I got this guy's name here. Oh, no. Liberato De Caro. Liberato De Caro in 2022 did what's called an X-ray scattering test, basically to try to test the degradation of the cellulose in the threads that make up the shroud. And what he determined with his test was that the shroud dates to exactly 2,000 years old, which is when it would need to come from. And to make the case stronger, he performed the same test on other cloths that they already knew the dates of, and the test returned accurate results for those dates as well. So this is actually the thing that made the shroud go viral last year, last summer.
This test you're talking about?
Yeah, because even though this test was done in 2022, it took until the summer of 2024 for the bloggers to hear about it. So even though it was in my video first.
But just real quick, to clarify something, I don't know, Jake, if a carbon dating or another test were done and it disproved or it had the same results back, I don't think it would upend Christianity, because Christianity
you're right.
is so much based on faith anyway. I mean, you have to have faith, and there's not a whole lot of scientific evidence, like we would have for biological evidence, so to speak.
Well,
like you have in society today. So it would be, I don't think it would upend Christianity or upend the Catholic Church. Yeah. However, if it did prove, if the tests did come back, more and more of these tests that put it 2,000 years ago, it would only make Christianity stronger and make the church stronger. Yeah. So I don't think it would hurt Christianity or the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I wanted to clarify that point too, because there is good historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus apart from the Shroud of Turin. This is something I actually just gave a presentation at a church a few days ago, last week, on this. The historical evidence of the resurrection just from the New Testament, examining the New Testament manuscripts as historical data, gives a very strong case for the resurrection. So in an epistemological sense, in terms of coming to a rational conclusion that the resurrection of Jesus actually happened, we don't really need the shroud in that sense, because we already have the New Testament, and the New Testament is incredibly accurate and reliable as historical documents go. So the shroud is more like the icing on the cake. Now, I do think that God has given it to us today for a reason. I think that perhaps modern people need it in a sense in order to start taking the claims of Christianity more seriously. And then once, they have the shroud in front of them, it will haunt them to the point to where they actually start to investigate Jesus in the Bible.
As more of a factual, or with more of a leaning toward scientifically proven.
Yes, exactly. It's like now there's scientific credibility to Christianity's claims because we have this miraculous image that we don't know what to do with. We don't know how to explain it.
You just said something that I want to challenge, and that is that,
Sure.
when you talk about the New Testament and, going, of course, if you go to the Bible or the manuscripts that contributed to the Bible, the foundation of the Christian church, well, of course there's going to be quote-unquote evidence there for the resurrection of Christ and whatnot. I'm talking about secular evidence, so to speak, to tie in with what you're saying about all the people who are agnostic and who are on the fence with Christianity right now or have no interest in it whatsoever.
Yeah.
If this could be proven through secular means, it's almost like God does not want us to, because a lot of Christianity is faith-based. You have to have faith and belief regardless of what we're told in society, right? And
sure.
regardless of what the science, which is created by man or explored by mankind, shows you.
I didn't even touch on it in the way I should have. Like, we all believe in gravity, right? In the same way some people might believe in, Christian God or, polytheistic gods or whatever, but it's been proven already that gravity, or like the theory of relativity and Einstein's idea of gravity, does not hold true at the smallest, like, subatomic scale or like larger, like cosmological universal scale. But we believe in gravity, right?
Yeah, there's always going to be a leap of faith somewhere in there. I mean, even with the shroud, once you've sort of come to the end of all the data, even though there's a lot of it, it still comes to the point where you're like, well, what could have done this? You're left with two options. It's either God did it or aliens did it, So it's like...
do you believe in astronaut theory, by the way? You know what astronaut theory is, right?
Yeah, I do.
We won't break off on
that. I don't believe in that.
You don't
no,
believe in
I
astronaut
don't. I think it makes for good television, but it's not. But no, I don't believe that.
I'm interested, but I do want to cover, you mentioned the Sudarium of Oviedo, is that correct?
Yes.
So, to your understanding, how much does that align from, if you were to lay the headcloth of Sudarium of Oviedo in alignment with the Shroud of Turin? Have those been more or less proven to align, or are there inconsistencies between the two? Or?
Yeah, the Sudarium of Oviedo is very interesting. In case you don't know, it's a second cloth that looks very similar to the Shroud, but it doesn't have an image on it. And the Sudarium is about 3 feet long, and it's covered in blood. It has bloodstain patterns on it. Excuse me. And these bloodstain patterns match the dimensions of the face on the shroud. So some people are tempted to look at the Sudarium and they think that the two main blotches that they see look like eyes, and they do kind of look like eyes, but actually they align with the bloodstains on the nose of the shroud. So the Sudarium, it looks like, would have been used to soak up the blood that was running down Jesus's face and specifically coming out of his nose. And the Sudarium has crease marks on it from where it looks like it was either rolled up or folded up diagonally. So there's question about where it would have been in the burial process, because the Bible, the Gospel of John specifically mentions that there were the burial cloths, but then there was a separate handkerchief that had been folded and put into a separate place inside of the tomb. So the Sudarium would be that handkerchief that had been around his head at some point. Now, obviously, it wasn't laying over his face inside of the shroud, because otherwise there would probably be an image on the Sudarium. But what we do know about the Sudarium is that the blood has been analyzed on both cloths, and they both came back as type AB positive. So it's the same kind of blood, and because the bloodstain patterns match, it seems like it covered the same person.
I think
Also,
it was just
they
me
took.
reading my
So
novel.
you're saying Jesus was AB positive with his blood type?
Yes, exactly, exactly.
That's the claim. And,
I'm not
just-
laughing. I find that.
Yeah.
I'm not laughing at you.
And as
I
I
find that
understand
kinda
it,
interesting.
as I understand it, I'm not a doctor, but I believe that's a universal donor.
So I'm actually AB positive as well.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, just kidding.
Same blood as Jesus.
We're gonna have all the AB positive people. We're related to Christ. All
Yeah.
the rest of y'all are inferior to us.
Pretenders, no.
Well, I like to do that too because the man on the shroud is about 5'10", which is how tall I am. So I'm like, I'm as tall as Jesus.
We actually had going back to my childhood with my grandparents. I was mentioning that my dad grew up with a Catholic mother, Christian father, and they had like a small little boat in like middle of nowhere, Arkansas, and we went out to this nearby lake, and there was a couple like stranded in their boat on what was clearly like a sandbar with not as much water over it as they thought. And me being like the younger one of the group, they sent me across to like go bring them a rope to like kind of tow them. And with how shallow the water was, they always made it a joke about me walking on water. So it's not just the AB blood. I could walk on water. I just
Awesome.
Give me some water. Oh, and now it's
Hey, turn this into wine.
Exactly.
No, I'm kidding.
But the other remarkable thing, though, that makes the Sudarium so amazing in its relationship to the shroud is that the known history of the Sudarium goes back to the 7th century, which is way before the carbon dating result from the shroud. So if the shroud and the Sudarium covered the same man and the same man bled onto both cloths, then the shroud has to be older than medieval times. It has to go back to at least the 7th century because that's when
We're
the
getting closer.
Sudarium was around.
We're getting closer.
Oh yeah, we're getting a lot closer. And there's separate evidence for how the Sudarium, for how we got the Sudarium, because it's in Spain. It's in Oviedo, Spain. But of course, the shroud is now in Italy.
And the shroud, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the shroud was found where? I could easily find this out. Where was it discovered?
So in 1355, it popped up in France,
Right,
in
okay.
Liry, France. That was where
Right.
it was first put on display, and people came to see it.
Do we know how it was discovered? Who found it and who brought it forth? Or did someone find it and it kind of maybe survived for hundreds of years or whatever before someone...
Yes, so there is very good, I think, very good historical research into how the shroud got from Jerusalem to France. It most likely was taken originally out of Jerusalem.
Knights Templar, here we go.
It was probably
what I
was thinking.
it was probably taken out of Jerusalem in the 1st century, and it was probably taken up to Antioch, which is north of Jerusalem in modern-day Turkey. And the reason for that is because, and even the Book of Acts explains this, Jerusalem was a very dangerous place because there was
it was.
there was a lot of conflict between the Romans and the Jewish zealots there. So there was a lot of infighting.
Glad it's not like that anymore.
Yeah, and there was a lot of persecution going on as well. Antioch was a safe place for the Christians, and Antioch is actually where they were first called Christians, according to the Book of Acts. So Antioch was also where Luke was from, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. There's a strong possibility that Luke is the one who took it to Antioch. In Antioch, it was eventually passed on to probably some disciples, maybe some bishops later on. They're the ones who sort of in the 500s, I believe, in the 6th century, they started sort of parading it around that area, sort of north of Antioch, and it became public knowledge at that point. At that point, it was seized by the emperor at the time, and it was brought to Constantinople.
So Constantine?
Well, it was later. It was later than Constantine, but it was taken to the city of Constantinople.
Okay, I don't know who the emperor was at the time.
Well, there's several of them. If you watch my part two video, it's the history of the shroud.
And that is modern day Istanbul, right? That's how the song goes. Yeah,
yeah.
Istanbul, not.
Yes.
Constantinople is
Right.
Istanbul.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Constantinople is Istanbul. Yes.
Calling out the Ritz, something like that.
But from there, the short of it is that it was kept in the palace at Constantinople, and it was actually hidden away for a couple of centuries because so Christianity in its vast history of 2 millennia has always gone back and forth on whether images of God are allowed. So this is iconic.
Like the Muhammad, sort of.
Right.
Practice,
So this is the debate about whether icons should be a thing, because in the Old Testament, God forbid any images of Himself being made. So for the Christians, they started to debate whether or not it was even okay to have an image of Jesus. Now there is artwork depicting Jesus from early on, but so every time the majority opinion would switch between the people who were in favor of icons and then the iconoclasts who were against icons, the shroud would have to be hidden from the people who were against the icons, because they were out destroying the images of Christ. So in Constantinople, this thing gets hidden away, and then it gets forgotten about. And that at that point, that was when the legends about it started to circulate, because people started to remember, wasn't there a thing? Wasn't there this thing that they were showing that was like the burial cloth of Christ? Do we have that thing? And then we actually have an inventory report from I forget the year. I think it's around 1000, the year 1000, that a guy went into the palace like treasury and took inventory of everything in there, and he noted what he called the burial syndones of Christ. Syndones just meaning cloth, and he described it as a full image of Jesus. And eventually, Constantinople was taken over by the Knights Templar, and at that point, it is believed that one of the knights possibly took it from Constantinople over to Athens. There were a lot of Knights Templar stationed in Athens. And it's very possible that one particular knight, when he retired, probably took the shroud with him from Athens back home to France. That's sort of the best running theory, I think, although there are multiple options about who those knights were, and how exactly that was done. But I think that there is some genealogical evidence that would connect one particular knight who had served in Athens to the de Charny family who lived in Liry, France. So there's a bit of a blank space directly before 1355. There's about 200 years of nothing there where we're really not sure who had it and where it was. But 200 years, by all accounts, is a pretty short span considering two millennia. So I think that that's a very reliable history of where the shroud was.
Yeah, I mean, there's missing artifacts from World War II, that we can't really trace back for where they all of a sudden reappeared, and that's
there you go.
six decades ago.
Yeah.
But going back even earlier, what is your understanding of how Christianity came to be, and like how the name, where the name come from? Is that something that you're familiar with? Like, why did Christians become Christians, right? Like, if they were followers of Jesus, right? Like,
yeah,
Christ, Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
That's
okay, yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah. Christian, yeah.
Well, the Christians were first called Christians in Antioch in the 1st century. So we know that from the book of Acts. We know that the book of Acts was most likely written by Luke, the beloved physician. He was a traveling companion of Paul. Paul wrote his letters in the 50s AD into the 60s AD. Paul was martyred sometime before 68 AD. There in the late 60s AD. And we know that Paul knew Peter and James, Jesus' brother, and he knew John. He met them in Jerusalem at some point. We know
Jesus'
that...
his half-brother.
Right, half-brother, if that's the way you want to put it. Or Catholics believe he was his cousin.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. There's some debate about that. I'm really not sure personally which way I go on that at the moment. The Greek word for brother and cousin is the same. So
Now we're really lost.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. But also, I mean, 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and John, they were of the 12 disciples, the original 12 disciples. So John and Matthew, those are their firsthand testimonies of being with Jesus and Jesus's ministry. John was at the crucifixion. It is assumed that the Gospel of Mark is the testimony of Peter because it's very Peter-centric. And so by all accounts, we have very good reasons to believe that the Gospels are reliable historical accounts. And the thing that Christianity banks on above everything else is the resurrection of Jesus. So the fact that the disciples claimed that after Jesus was crucified, that the Sunday after, Jesus physically rose from the dead and appeared to them, that was their claim. And then he walked around with them, he talked to them, he ate with them, they gave him food to eat, they hugged him, they felt him. He invited Thomas to touch his wounds, if you remember. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that he was seen by 500 people all at the same time. We don't know who those 500 people were, but that's what Paul says. Paul claimed to have seen the resurrected Christ as well. He appeared to him on the road to Damascus. So that is where Christianity began. Christianity, Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, right. But he showed up and he claimed to be the Messiah. He claimed to be the God of the Old Testament in the flesh. Right. Emmanuel, God with us. He claimed to be Yahweh. In Exodus chapter 3, when God appears to Moses in the burning bush, God refers to himself. Moses asks him, well, who am I going to tell the Hebrews sent me? And God says, tell them, I am has sent you. I am that I am. That's the name that God gave to himself in Exodus 3. Well, fast forward to John chapter 8. That's the name that Jesus calls himself in front of the Pharisees. And they immediately,
is a big no-no.
Yes, right. Huge no-no, because that's blasphemy unless you're telling the truth. And that was when they tried to stone him there in John chapter 8. But actually, he claimed to be I am in a few other places as well. That Greek phrase is ego eimi. It just says I am. And when it's used without any kind of predicate grammatically, that's when you can assume that he's making an actual divine claim upon himself. So Jesus claimed to be God himself in the flesh. And he said that he was going to prove it by dying and then rising from the dead on the 3rd day. The resurrection of Jesus is the evidence. It is the proof that Jesus is God. And that is why the first century Christians worshiped Jesus as God. And we actually have testimony from outside of the Bible, from other historical documents that affirm that the Christians were worshiping Jesus as a God, which is why this is why they were martyred, not because they worshiped Jesus as God, but because they would deny that Caesar was a God.
That's right. Yep,
and the reason, Rome. Yeah, and because they denied that because
there's only one true God.
There's only one true God, and he is Jesus.
Right.
So, and that we know that they worshipped him as God.
Can I segue real quickly into something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Now, and you, we talked about this. Christian apologetic or apologist.
Apologetics.
Yes. I am unaware of that. Explain that to me, because it ties with what we're talking about, of course. But
yes,
to me, it's why are you apologizing, right? So
right.
Fill me in.
It doesn't mean apologize.
Right.
What it means is to give a defense. Now, if you go to what it is it's just a fancy theological word, is all it is. And it refers to the field of Christian theology where we focus on the evidence for Christianity, whether that's historical and archaeological evidence like the New Testament manuscripts or
the Shroud of Turin.
Archaeological digs, Shroud of Turin. It could also be philosophical evidence for the existence of God, be scientific evidence for intelligent design and creation, any of that sort of stuff. It comes from 1 Peter 3:15, where Peter says, be ready at all times to give a defense for the hope that is in you. That word defense is apologia in the Greek. It is where we get the word apology, to say you're sorry, but it also means like a legal defense, like you go to court and you give an explanation, you give an account for why you did something or the way you think the way that you do. So Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 3 that anytime somebody asks us why we're a Christian, why do we believe that Jesus is God, why do we believe that Jesus rose from the dead, we should be ready to tell them not just our personal testimony, but also like the evidence, the reasons why we think that. So that's what apologetics is.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you think there is a
and by the way, I just want to say this too. It's not weird, by the way, to not know that word. Most Christians do not know this word.
I have been raised in the Christian church. I've never heard that before today.
Yeah, it's more of a buzzword, honestly. I mean, you can get a degree in apologetics now, which my dad did. He got a bachelor's degree in apologetics from Luther Rice University. But it's kind of a buzzword that's grown in the last probably 40 or 50 years. It hasn't always been a thing. So, and you wouldn't know about it unless you had some sort of exposure to someone who claimed that title for themselves anyway. Someone like Josh McDowell, who wrote one of the earlier modern books about the evidence for the resurrection, More Than a Carpenter.
Have you ever heard of like Ken Ham? And I remember going back a decade or more now, actually. So Brian, our producer, he grew up in a Christian household. Is that correct, Brian? You grew up in a Christian household. Is that correct? Christian, Catholic, quasi? Quasi. But he, for a little while, and apologies, Brian, if you look at it otherwise, almost went like fanatical atheism, right? In some way you
that happens.
Like, have fanatical like Christians or any religious, a religion, almost went like trying to convert the other way. But do you think like there's some sort of possibility that Jesus, like, he did get crucified, he got buried, and like was incapacitated, and like came up a few days later after being essentially like the equivalent of a coma? I mean, is that a possibility in your mind, or is there evidence counter to that, or I mean, how do you think about that?
So there are lots of alternative hypotheses that people have come up with to try to say, well, what might have happened here. What you just described, where he sort of goes into a coma, or maybe he like does like almost die right there and then just sort of wakes up later. That's what's called the swoon theory, which is that he just sort of swooned and they thought he was dead, but then he got back up and walked out somehow. But see, these alternative explanations all fail for a number of reasons because of the historical data that surrounds them. I mean, the swoon theory, I think, is pretty obviously wrong, because if Jesus had been tortured and flogged and scourged and then crucified by the Romans, I mean, he's bleeding out everywhere. It's unbelievable, first of all, that the Romans didn't actually kill him, because they were professional executioners. But let's say he did survive, and he did manage to stumble his way out of the tomb. If the apostles saw him in that state, they wouldn't have thought that he was a gloriously resurrected Messiah. They would have thought that he was just lucky. And he probably wouldn't have survived much longer after that. And there's no way that he would have been able to appear to other people.
And have a meal with them.
And have a meal with them. And then furthermore, I mean, this wouldn't transform. The thing about the apostles, too, is they went from being kind of dumb cowards, honestly. I mean, they all ran away, right? And throughout Jesus' ministry, they're asking consistently dumb questions. I mean, I don't think we give them enough credit, because they were faced with some pretty unbelievable things. But after the resurrection of Jesus, they became bold religious leaders. They founded the church. They became like real leaders
And
in
many
the
were
community.
martyred, as you say, right?
Yes,
So they
and
gave
we
their
know
lives.
that they were
Who
martyred.
said
Yeah,
that? Was it Thomas or Peter was martyred, was crucified upside down? Which one?
tradition says that Peter was crucified upside
Yeah,
down. That when
yeah.
he went to be crucified, he requested to be turned upside down so that he wouldn't be crucified in the same manner as Christ. But apart from this too, the swim theory also wouldn't explain like how the skeptics later on would become Christians. For example, Paul. Paul is a huge part of this equation because Paul was a Pharisee who hated the Christians and spent all his time hunting them down. He got permission to basically, shoot on sight anybody he found. And he would collect their garments and he would approve and he would stand by while Christians were stoned and beaten and martyred. And so for him to suddenly become a Christian really goes to show that something extraordinary happened. So it just seems very unlikely that really accounts for anything. And there's all sorts of these other explanations, like, well, maybe Jesus had a twin. It's like, well, where was he this whole time?
One that looked like Danny DeVito,
right? And why would his mother and his brother / cousin think that his twin was him resurrected? That doesn't make any sense. They knew what was going on. So I always challenge skeptics. Come up with an alternative explanation. People have tried, and the historical data just doesn't allow a way out. It just doesn't.
And yeah, I do see like it's pretty much across the board, across religions, that Jesus was a historical figure, right?
Yes.
And then there's a lot of of course, a lot of the writings, even from my understanding, the New Testament, are all even 60 years post Jesus's life, or 30 to 60 years starting right post his life. And you're talking about the New Testament being like a good historical record. What do you think about the Old Testament, like prior to, because that's all prior to Christianity, right? That's all based off like
Judaic.
Judaic, like Christian values,
Judaic
like
laws.
more moral, ethical teachings, as I understand it. But do you think there's anything to be like taken away from the Old Testament as historical document versus moral teachings? And where do you think that line is drawn? If there's a clear spot to draw that line.
So in the New Testament, you have the Gospels and then the book of Acts. You have those 5 books that are very historical. It's like historical narrative. The Old Testament is even more so, whereas the New Testament, like half of it is epistles. It's just sort of the religious teaching of the apostles. The Old Testament is almost all historical narrative, intermingled, of course, with the proclamations of the prophets at the time, the major prophets, the minor prophets, the prophets from before the Babylonian captivity and then after the Babylonian captivity. And then, of course, you have the Davidic kingdom going back from all these kings through Solomon to David, David's lineage and his connection to Abraham and Moses in the past, and then going back to them in Genesis through Noah and Adam. So, yeah, I think there is very good reason to take the Old Testament seriously as history. There is tons of evidence. It's harder to find evidence for the Old Testament because it was so much farther back.
Right.
But there is evidence that affirms those things. For example, the city of Jericho has been found, and it does appear that there is an ancient wall that's lying flat on the ground there because, according to the story in the Bible, in the book of Joshua, the walls fell down after Israel marched around it 7 times and blew their trumpets. So there's stuff like that. There's interesting evidence from the locations of Sodom and Gomorrah that they've actually found burned rocks there from the fire and brimstone that rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah. So there is some evidence for David as well. And so, yeah, I think that the Old Testament is historical, and I've never seen any evidence that directly contradicts it either, and that's what's really remarkable. The harder part would be in the early chapters of Genesis, which go way back before written history. That's when it gets really fuzzy. But the rest of the Old Testament, from Genesis 12 all the way to the end of Malachi, I think that that's very solid stuff.
Now, going back to like what I've heard, like with Ken Ham debates. Again, this is me trying to recall from like a decade or more.
Sure.
About like the age of the Earth was always one that never made sense for me, and like again, I forgot what it's called, but like New Age fundamentalism or whatever. That it's like a
Young Earth creationism.
Young Earth
Yeah. Yes.
Close enough. Right? That it's about 6,000 years old. Is that your understanding, or I mean, that's more kind of like metaphorical? You know, billions of years were days, or just unknown.
No. I am not a young Earth creationist. I am an old Earth creationist. I believe that the book of Genesis does not tell us the age of the Earth. Maybe it tells us the age of humanity, but I don't think that that's the case either. I think that there are gaps in the genealogy in the book of Genesis. I think that there's good reason to believe that when you read those names, that those are representatives of families and not necessarily like meant to be understood exactly as it's written, because at that time they wrote in different ways about that sort of stuff. So yeah, the young Earth creationists like Ken Ham argue that because if you add up those genealogies, it takes you back to about 6,000 years ago. And, you know, Genesis makes it sound like, you know, the Earth and the entire universe was made in 7 days. So you just tack a week onto that, and the whole thing is 6,000 years old. I'm an old Earth creationist. My dad was an old Earth creationist. My dad published his own book about this subject. We started out being closely affiliated with Hugh Ross's ministry, Reasons to Believe, and participated in the Atlanta chapter of Reasons to Believe for many years. And Hugh Ross's position is the more widely accepted old Earth position, which is that the 7 days of creation described in Genesis chapter 1 were actually long ages each. They weren't actual 24 hours of time. Now, my dad in his book departed from that view, even still being an old Earth creationist, to what's called the prophetic days view. And his book is available on Amazon and on Kindle. It's called Genesis, Science, and the Beginning by Benjamin Smith Jr. And the way the prophetic days view goes is that the 7 days of creation in Genesis chapter 1 were 7 literal 24-hour days, but they were 7 literal 24-hour days over which God proclaimed what he was going to do, and then those proclamations were fulfilled over an unspecified amount of time. Could have been a very long amount of time after those proclamations. So that's what I tend to think, which means, number one, Genesis doesn't tell us the age of the Earth. Genesis doesn't really tell us how old humanity is. I think that we can generally fall back on the scientific evidence for that. I think that humanity goes back about 300,000 years. I think that Homo sapiens are, they're the only humans that have ever existed. Some old Earth creationists, such as William Lane Craig in his book, In Quest of the Historical Adam, he argues that Adam and Eve were actually members of the species Homo heidelbergensis, which would have lived about 1 million years ago. I think that that's a little too far. I respectfully disagree with him, even though I love him dearly. I love him very much.
Really quick, you think humans have always been Homo sapien, and
yes,
and you think what we call human is Homo sapien, and that's just separate from hominids, but you thought you're of the understanding that there were separate ape-like species, hominids, but did not evolve into Homo sapiens.
I believe that there were hominids that were not human, who didn't have a spirit. That okay. at some point in the human evolutionary line, I think Homo sapiens is when God intervened and introduced their rational and moral and creative spirit into the creature, and that first man was Adam, and then the first woman was Eve.
Okay. And now, something that also, like, going back to high school, I was a self-proclaimed, my name being Jacob. I went by Jake at the time, in middle school. when people would ask like, "What religion are you?" I'm Jaconism. I'm
Right.
School of my own thought, right?
Yeah.
And as I got into high school, like I started realizing again, kind of grew up in the Bible Belt. But I never thought about it as like a super like religious area because it's not country around here, right? Well, less so than what it used to be.
Yeah.
But in any case, I remember this like really what I consider to be smart, and not to say he's not, but what was just like totally eye-opening to me that he was like this really brilliant like engineering academic kid, and then he was talking about like the people as described in the Bible lived many hundreds of years old, and that like human genetics have gotten worse over time. And I was like, I've never heard, and that to me like crazy at the time. I still think it's like kind of a little off the wall, but what are your thoughts on the people described to like Methuselah described to, I guess, 969 years old, Jared 962, Noah 950, Adam 930, even post-flood, you have Isaac living to 180, and again, this is all being prompted from ChatGPT, so these could all be wrong compared to your understanding.
No, those are the numbers in the Old Testament. Methuselah was the oldest living person. It says 969 years. As to what to do with those ages, personally right now, I'm not entirely sure. I'm sort of inclined to take them literally because it was so long ago that we couldn't know. Right. And I'm not sure how you could analyze, for example, if we found Methuselah's skeleton, let's just say it was labeled Methuselah. Right. How would we determine that this man lived 900 years? Scientifically speaking, I don't know the answer to that question. Yep. Now, reasons to believe, Hugh Ross and Fazell Rana, they have worked on this question. They do have some scientific answers to what that could mean. So, I do trust them in regards to that question. However, I am starting to think myself, though I'm still not sure, I'm starting to think that maybe those numbers, well, first of all, I would say, I think that humans did used to live longer. That's for sure, because at one point in Genesis, God does say, I am going to limit humanity's years to 120, okay? And we do know people live that long even today. Some people do actually make it to 120. So it's really not inconceivable to think that people could have lived longer than that, I think, with healthier diets, healthier lifestyle, healthier environment, and all of that.
Yeah,
I think it's
with the limiter off, maybe to like use your analogy for like cars and the car industry. Hey, your car can do 180, but the manufacturer limits it to 120. Again, maybe there's a limit.
Yeah, there may be some. Yeah, because there's got to be a kill switch in those things for some, in smartphones too. It reaches a certain age and it just dies. So I think that there is something to that. I think that those longer ages probably did happen, but were they actually that long? I don't know, because it seems like when we look at ancient records, they tend to exaggerate the numbers for either political purposes or artistic purposes. I take Genesis literally, but I think that those numbers could very well be an ancient way of speaking about those people that gives some other kind of inclination of their greatness or maybe their righteousness or their closeness with God, perhaps. I think that there may be something to that, but yeah, even though I do get preoccupied with these sorts of questions, it doesn't really bother me so much. This would actually be a good point to say, because at this point I can just hear all of the atheists and agnostics watching going, oh, look at him, he's just trying to brush off the dumbest part of the Bible. It's like, okay, well, look, there are things in the Bible I don't know how to explain. I do have a fun video on my channel about the Nephilim. It's like, okay, cool. Angels having babies with humans, okay, whatever. Humans living to long ages, okay. Talking snake in the garden, all right. Look, there's stuff, I don't know exactly what to do with these things. But here's the thing. that is not what Christianity relies on,
Right.
or even Judaism.
Right.
What Christianity relies on is the resurrection of Jesus. If the resurrection of Jesus is true, then Jesus is God. And I want to ask Jesus one day how he reads the book of Genesis, okay? It seems like from the ways that Jesus quoted Genesis that he took it to be very literal. So I would love to ask those questions someday, but my faith is not based on the genealogies in Genesis.
Right.
My faith is based on the resurrection of Jesus. I said genealogies in Jesus. The genealogies in Genesis, my faith is not based on that. My faith is based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if the historical documentation in the New Testament points to that, then I am rational to believe it, even if I can't prove some of the other things in the Bible. Like, for example, the virgin birth. We don't have any way of proving that today, but I believe it's true because that was the testimony of the apostles. That was the testimony of the disciples who knew Mary, and they all knew Jesus.
No.
So these secondary questions about Genesis and creation don't really affect whether or not you should become a Christian. You can be a Christian and hold any number of views on Genesis. You can be an old earth creationist, you can be a young earth creationist. As long as you believe that God created humanity, that humanity has sinned against God, and that death is our penalty, and that Jesus pays that price for us by his death on the cross, then that makes you a Christian.
That's
yes,
the message.
That's the gospel message.
Yeah.
Regardless of how old you think everything is.
A minister that was very important to me growing up, the pastor of my church, Dr. Bob Schrum.
Okay.
And he was a philosophy major from University of South Carolina, got his PhD, and he told me once that having religious debates is pointless because of what we're talking about right here. There's no way to concretely prove,
Sure.
even with the Shroud, as was our lead in here.
Right.
We've got some proof. It doesn't line up with what we necessarily want to hear as Christians, but so it comes down to faith. You have to have faith, and there's no way to this is my opinion, lines with what you just said. You can't have a debate based on societal norms
Right.
that we would have in a normal debate to prove something or disprove something. With religion, not only Christianity, but so many faiths.
Or even just science, like we were
so many
talking
religions. It comes down to your faith, what you
Yep.
believe, and you kind of have to come to terms with that and accept that, I feel.
Yeah, you just need to be careful about what your faith is based on. The reason that God has given us the scriptures is so that we have something reliable to base our faith on. You know, God never tells us to close our eyes and our ears and just believe in whatever he says. Like, he's given us good reasons to believe that he's there, that he exists. He's given us good reasons to believe that Jesus is God. And he's given us good reasons to believe that if we pray to him and we seek him, we will find him in our personal lives, and we will have that personal encounter with Christ. And anyone who is a born-again Christian will have that testimony in their life of how they sought out God and they found him. And I think that the Shroud, too, points to this as well, which is when you're looking at the Shroud, I mean, you can get caught up in the debates and everything with it, but at the end of the day, you get, you know, in the middle of the night after you've read the entire Wikipedia page, you're still going to go back and you're still going to be looking at the picture, and you're looking at the face of Jesus. You're looking into his eyes. You're looking at his face, and he's staring right back at you. And it becomes incredibly real at that point that, oh my gosh, I don't have an explanation for this. This might actually be a photograph of Jesus. And if that's true, if that really did happen, then he is calling you. He is calling you to trust in him. You can feel that tug on your soul from the Holy Spirit calling you and drawing you into his grace and his mercy and his love. And that's the power of the Shroud right there, that you are looking at the face of Christ and he's calling you to himself.
Wow.
Now, I do want to kind of close it out with this. So you're talking about like Jesus with while he was around pre, Christianity being a religion. claiming to be the one true God. Do you think there's any overlap between that and the idea like where God is omnipresent, omniscient, omniscient,
Omnipotent.
Omnipotent, omnipresent, and what was the other? Omniscient?
Yes.
Yeah.
Omniscient, omnipresent.
All-knowing, everywhere,
Right.
total control.
And so, like, in that context, have you ever heard also, like, we're all like stardust, like the theory of everything, like, to me, those aren't necessarily exclusive from one of the other. Like, hey, we're all stardust, but hey, we're all part of God, right? Like, we're all like, we all have Jesus. We all have God in us. And again, I don't necessarily, have that belief in a pure Christian sense. But I think there is a lot of, like, to me, that seems very along the lines of what Jesus was preaching, even like calling himself God. Like, and to me, it's maybe not even, hey, I'm God. We're all one with God. Or is that like totally not what he was saying? Or
that is not Christian theology. Christian and Jewish theology in this sense is that creation is separate from God. That God is not part of his creation. Creation is not part of God. That God created the universe, and yes, he is omnipresent in the sense that he's ever with us, but we're not part of him and he's not part of us. The closest we come to that is that when a person accepts Christ as their Savior, they receive the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit indwells them like water fills a glass. And that regenerates our spirit. Okay, we are dying. That is our punishment for our sins. Is we are in this process of dying spiritually and physically as well. The Holy Spirit indwells us and regenerates our soul, regenerates our spirit, so that now we are being sanctified for heaven. We are being prepared to enter the presence of God as holy, righteous people. But Christ is our righteousness, is the way that Scripture says it. So that's not technically Christian theology, but, this is where I always try to make this connection. Even though that is not Christian theology, I think that what this idea speaks to is that humans, we are a very unique creation, and we have this unique desire to be one with God, to know him intimately, to know him personally. Sometimes we run away from that. Most of the time we probably run away from that. And so that desire is in us, and it fascinates us. So if you're the kind of person, whether you or anybody watching, if you're the kind of person who is fascinated by this idea that everything is part of God, or God is part of everything, pantheism, panentheism, what have you. No, number one, that's not what's taught in the Bible. But number two, you shouldn't be ashamed that concept sort of fascinates you, because God has promised us something very similar to that, which is that we are going to be with him forever. And the way that Paul describes it in 1 Corinthians is that we are going to put on righteousness, almost as if we are being further clothed in the holiness and the righteousness in God's presence. And in that sense, sometimes Christians describe us as, especially the Orthodox Christians, will describe this as a union with God. And that's fine, because there's a very fine line here about what we're describing.
Right.
The difference is that in a lot of in the Eastern religions, for example, everything being part of God weaves into more of their explanation for good and evil than it does of who God is. But in Christianity, we have like God created us for his pleasure. And so our purpose in life is to love God and for him to love us, for him to be pleased with us, but for us to also find our satisfaction and our enjoyment in him as well. And when that happens, we're going to be united with God for eternity when we are resurrected in the end. So, interesting ideas that I think point to an innate human desire to have that connection to the divine. But in Christianity, I think that we're promised something that's actually better and more beautiful and will bring us more joy in the end.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it also ties into one thing that my dad told me that just came back to mind back when I was at my great-grandfather's house down in Pelham, Georgia, like just 15 minutes north of the Florida line, so southern Georgia. And I forgot exactly what the context was, but I was kind of like freaked out by the concept of going to hell, right? Or like hell. Again, like as a young kid, I think that's somewhat common. But I remember my dad telling me this, and it's like stuck with me. Life is either hell or it's heaven, and it is what you make of it. And it's less so what happens after life, but it's what you do with your life. And again, obviously that's not coming from any definitive power, right? Just one guy's opinion, but that's the way that I've started to look at it. And we'll end with just this quick little clip that came to mind when we were talking about Jesus' preaching.
From the gods, who were terrified of what we might do with it were it to fall into our hairy little paws. When Prometheus was caught and brought to justice for his theft, the gods, well, you might say they overreacted. The poor man was tied to a rock.
Technical difficulties. The
okay.
HDMI cable came unplugged.
Froze.
All right, play it.
The gods, well, you might say they overreacted a little. The poor man was tied to a rock as an eagle ripped through his belly and ate his liver over and over, day after day, ad infinitum. All because he gave us fire, our first true piece of technology. Fire. Such a very long time ago. Which begs the question, what have we done with it? 100,000 BC, stone tools. 4,000 BC, the wheel. 800 BC, sundial. 9th century AD, gunpowder. Bit of a game changer, that one. 1441, the printing press. Only slightly less impactful. 19th century, steam engine, railway, eureka, the light bulb. 20th century, the automobile, television, nuclear weapons, spacecraft, internet. 21st century, biotech, nanotech, fusion and fission and M theory. And that was just the first decade. We are now 3 months into the year of our Lord, 2023. At this moment in our civilization, we are on the verge of terraforming planets undiscovered just a decade ago. We have identified the genetic chain of events behind 98% of cancers. A chain we have broken, effectively curing them. We can create cybernetic individuals who, in just a few short years, will be completely indistinguishable from us. Which leads to an obvious conclusion. We are the gods now.
Yep. I did hear about this, that we are God is kind of what the message is.
Yes.
Need to close it up?
Yes.
Duran, great to meet you, and thanks for being on this podcast.
Yeah, well, my pleasure.
Have
Anytime.
you back.
Yeah. Any shout outs that you want to have for your website, channel, anything else that you have going on?
Yeah, so my website is verimyth.com, VERIMYTH. Verimyth means true story. I got that from C.S. Lewis. And I have a YouTube channel, VeriMyth Pictures. There's videos on there about the Shroud of Turin. There's videos about the evidence for the resurrection. There are numerous other videos, one about Nephilim, and there's various other things dealing with the hell, universalism, annihilationism, that sort of stuff. And of course, I'm working on some other things. I'm working on an in-depth analysis on the carbon dating for the Shroud. I'm working on some other videos that will deal with other theological topics as well. And then I work with a national apologetics organization called Ratio Christi, which is actually the hat that I'm wearing right now. Ratio Christi is a national college apologetics ministry program, and my chapter is located at Johnson Ferry Baptist Church. It's called Ratio Christi Atlanta, so we have meetings there. If anybody's interested in that, you can just go to verimyth.com and you'll see the details about that. I'm also on Facebook, on Instagram, on X, and now on Threads. I'm seeing how that works. So yeah, there's plenty of ways to connect with me, and also I rely on support for the things that I do. So if anybody is interested in supporting my ministry and the things that I do, please check that out. I need all the support I can get. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure talking to y'all and meeting you, and I'll be happy to talk some more about anything. Yeah.
Well, likewise, Duran, thank you for joining us. Please, everyone that can, go support Duran. And one message I would like to just leave everyone with this conversation around belief. Again, my personal opinion, I think the most important belief of them all is the one in yourself. And if you don't take that from me, take it from the Arthur theme song. It's the best place to start.
Best place to start. Yes. All right.
Duran, again, pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks.
Yes. So much
Jim, I
fun.
know you are in
an unusually rushed state here. So
that's okay.
please pardon me.
That is okay.
Stopping recording, hour and 33 minutes.